redecorated the parlor, she'd resisted the current fashion for darker shades of red. Instead, she'd spent many hours searching for soothing blues, which were a more personal statement of her tastes. She had deluded herself into thinking this day would never come, that her brother would never marry, and she'd always serve as the mistress of this house and hostess for his business affairs. Yet at times she'd sensed the emptiness in his heart, hidden beneath a stiff exterior and demanding business and social life, and wished he could find a congenial life companion. She glanced up at the portrait of Lawrence and herself, painted 12 years ago, at the start of her first season. Callers always admired the picture of the tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed siblings. A much younger Elizabeth, dressed in the white silk and lace gown she'd worn to her debutante ball, sat in front of her brother. Lawrence, in formal evening clothes, stood behind Elizabeth with his hand protectively on her shoulder. Hope threaded through her hurt. Perhaps in Lawrence's bride she'd find a true sister to fill the empty place in her heart, caused by her best friend's marriage and move to Montana. Even though they'd been separated for 10 years, she missed Pamela so much. How wonderful to have a close confidant once again, someone to help banish the loneliness trailing after her like a phantom. A vision of Elizabeth's personal ghost slipped into her mind. Tall and handsome, with laughing brown eyes and a playful grin. Richard, her beloved fiancé. The fingers of her right hand crept up to her chest, a familiar gesture, to clasp the gold locket containing his picture. If Richard had lived, he'd be teasing her now with outrageous descriptions of Lawrence's wife. In her laughter, she'd forget her pain. Of course, if he'd lived, this wouldn't be an issue. Somehow, after his death, 11 years had slipped by. Although she'd had offers, no one had measured up to Richard, and she refused to marry any man she didn't love. Besides, her brother had always said he needed her. Tears welled in her eyes. "I hope, Lawrence," she told the portrait, "you found the kind of love Richard and I had." Katie burst through the door of Elizabeth's parlor. "They're here, Miss Hamilton." "Thank you, Katie." "Yes, Miss Hamilton." The maid left the room. Excited in spite of all her fears, Elizabeth set down her book of poetry and took a steadying breath. Then she rose and walked into the hall, determined to show her brother and his new wife a proper welcome. Her brother stood with his arm around a petite, dark-haired woman dressed in gray with black lace trim. At first glance, Genia appeared younger than Elizabeth had expected, only 22 or 23. Her big brown eyes with dark lashes and brows gazed frankly at Elizabeth. Her nose had a pert tilt. She smiled, revealing a slight overbite. "Here she is." Lawrence gestured with his free hand toward Elizabeth. "Genia, my dear, this is your new sister." He bowed and spoke with a gallantry Elizabeth had never before seen him display. "Elizabeth, I'd like you to meet my lovely bride, Genia." Elizabeth barely had time to register the astonishing change in her reserved brother. He seemed so animated, so happy. Her heart lightened in response. She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle out of her green silk dress and crossed the few steps to give her new sister-in-law a kiss on the cheek. "Welcome, Genia. I've been looking forward to meeting you." "Dearest Elizabeth, Lawrence has told me so much about you." "I wish I could say the same," Elizabeth murmured with a wry glance at Lawrence that he didn't acknowledge. Instead, he beamed at his new bride. "You're so pretty, Elizabeth," Genia bubbled. "Why, I'd never have taken you for a spinster." Spinster. The word hit Elizabeth like a slap across her face. Was that how people would see her now? As a 29-year-old dried-up old maid? She repressed a shudder. Was that how she'd come to see herself? No, never. She'd known a deep and abiding love. When Genia knew her better, she'd understand. Genia gushed on. "I can't believe we're finally here, although we've had a wonderful honeymoon. Haven't we, dear?" she asked with a coy glance up at her new husband. Color rose up Lawrence's throat, and a small sound escaped him. Apparently choked with emotion, he could only nod.